Hello, and welcome to the Magic Lantern DVD guide for the Nikon D90. Now, the D90 is the successor to the D80 and offers serious photographers a compact and lightweight digital SLR with many of the specifications, features, and characteristics of Nikon's D300, but with a price tag that's hundreds of dollars less. The 12.2 megapixel resolution, blazing fast performance, and dozens of customization options give the D90 enough versatility to compete effectively with any digital SLR on the market. It's an excellent camera that will have you shooting stunning images for years to come. But like all of today's cameras, the D90 has a lot of features and controls that can be confusing to understand at first, even for experienced SLR owners. And that's why I'm going to cut through the clutter and teach you what you need to know to get started shooting great pictures with the D90 right away. Now, I'm going to assume that you already have an understanding of basic photographic terms and concepts, because the purpose of this DVD is to focus specifically on how the D90 functions, so that you can choose the setup options and shooting techniques that will work best for you. Now, if you want to learn more about general photographic topics like composition, f-stop, shutter speed, and depth of field, then I suggest you watch the Magic Lantern DVD called Great Photos with your digital SLR. In it, I explain the basics of exposure, the differences among various types of lenses, tips for good composition, the use of creative exposure settings, and much more. Other resources you'll find helpful are the many great books on digital photography from Lark Photography Books. So let's get started, because we've got a lot of ground to cover. I think the best place to begin is to take a walk around the camera and get familiar with the functions of the external buttons, switches, and other controls. Then we'll go back later and take a closer look at most of them in other chapters of the DVD. I recommend that you get your camera out and follow along with me. Now, at times, you may want to pause the DVD to experiment with the settings and try things out for yourself. Also keep in mind that sometimes there are several different ways to achieve the same result. I'm not going to stop and point them all out. I'll show you one way, but don't be surprised if you discover a different way that works even better for you. Let's start on the top of the camera with the power switch. Now, to turn the camera on, I just rotate the switch to the on position, and it's ready and waiting by the time I can put my eye to the viewfinder. Now, at times, you may want to illuminate the LCD control panel so that you can see it better in low light. And you can do that by rotating the power switch a little further, and it will light up for a few seconds. The control panel shows you a lot of information about the current camera settings. In fact, there are about 24 different camera settings that can appear at various times on the control panel, including the flash mode, the battery condition, shutter speed, f-stop, the release mode, the remaining capacity of the memory card, the metering mode, the autofocus mode, the selected focus area, image size, image quality, and the white balance setting. Learning to understand what all of this information means and then how to change the camera settings represented on the display will be very important to the quality of the pictures you take. We'll be learning a lot more about all of these settings throughout the rest of the DVD. Nested inside the power switch is the shutter release button. Pressing it halfway down will activate the autofocus and auto exposure functions so that the camera can start making its calculations for taking the best picture. Fully depressing the shutter release button momentarily will fire the shutter once. And holding it down while the camera is set in continuous shooting mode will fire up to 4.5 frames per second. Now that's fast. Next to the shutter release button is the metering mode button for determining how the camera calculates the exposure for each picture, and the exposure compensation button that can be used to override the automatic exposure settings. To use either control, you just press the button down while you turn the main command dial at the rear of the camera to cycle through the choices. Next, there's the Release Mode button. There are 6 release mode choices on the D90 that control what the camera does when you press the shutter button. Most of the time, you'll want the camera to take just one picture only, but sometimes you'll want it to fire off several pictures in a row. Or maybe you'll want to use the self-timer so you can run over and get into the picture yourself. Changing the release mode is accomplished the same way that other camera settings are changed. You just hold the button down while you rotate the main command dial. The choices are single frame. This is the mode you'll use most often. The camera takes one photo each time the shutter release button is pressed. Continuous low speed. The camera will record from 1 to 4 frames per second, depending on how you've programmed its menu setting, while you hold down the shutter release button. The default speed is 3 frames per second. Continuous high speed. The camera will record up to 4.5 frames per second until you release the shutter button. Self-timer. Using the timer with the camera mounted on a tripod delays taking the picture by several seconds after you press the shutter button. The default length of the delay is 10 seconds, but it can easily be changed to 2 seconds, 5 seconds, or 20 seconds by changing the appropriate menu setting. Now, 10 seconds is good if you want to go over and get into the picture, but a 2-second delay is often used while shooting at slow shutter speeds to give the camera a chance to settle down after you press the shutter button, thus preventing blurry images. The final 2 release modes are Delayed Remote and Quick Response Remote. Both of these require the use of an optional remote control for releasing the shutter without even touching the camera. The next button is for changing the Autofocus Mode. There are 3 choices for how the camera focuses the lens. They are Auto Select, Single Servo, and Continuous Servo. We'll talk more about each one of them later in the Focus chapter. Over on the other side of the camera is the Mode dial for selecting the camera's shooting mode. Now, the D90 has 11 different shooting modes that determine how the camera calculates the exposure, fires the flash, processes the image before saving it to the memory card, and even how the autofocus system works. The shooting modes range in complexity from fully automatic, where the camera controls everything, all the way to fully manual, where you have to do all the work yourself. In fact, they can be divided up into 2 groups, the advanced modes and the point-and-shoot modes. The particular mode that you choose to use at any given time will depend on what you're shooting and how comfortable you are with changing some of the camera's settings yourself. But choosing the best mode for any given situation will make all the difference in how your pictures turn out. We'll take a detailed look at the different modes in a later chapter, and I'll have some suggestions as to which ones to use, when to use them, and which ones to avoid using at all. On the front of the D90, you'll find a number of other controls. Starting at the upper left corner, there's the sub-command dial, not to be confused with the main command dial we saw on the rear of the camera. The sub-command dial's main purpose is to set the aperture of the lens when you're shooting in the manual exposure mode. Over here, this small light actually serves 3 purposes. First, it functions as the autofocused assist illuminator by shining a beam of light to help the camera focus when you're shooting in dim lighting. Second, in self-timer mode, it blinks while the timer counts down. And third, it helps reduce the chances of red eye whenever you're using the flash. Below this light is a special programmable function button that gives you instant access to any one of 10 functions that you choose. You can program this button to do things like turn off the flash temporarily, display a framing grid in the viewfinder, or even to change the exposure metering method. Below the function button is the depth of field preview button. And when you press this button, the lens closes down to the actual aperture it will use to take the photo, so that you can get an idea of what the depth of field will look like in your picture. Moving over to the other side of the lens, this switch is the focus mode selector, and it offers two choices, manual focus or autofocus. Next is the lens release button. One of the great things about having an SLR is the ability to change lenses to suit different shooting situations. To remove a lens from the camera, make sure the camera is turned off. Then press down on the button, turn the lens clockwise, and take it off. Now to mount a lens on the camera, again, make sure the power is turned off. Align the index marks, slide the lens firmly into the mount, then rotate it counterclockwise until you hear it lock into place. Next is the bracketing button, which is used to turn on and off bracketing. Bracketing is an advanced feature that makes it easy to capture multiple images of the same scene with slightly different exposure or white balance settings, and then later on you can choose which one of them looks best. Just above the bracket button is the flash mode button, which is used to control how the flash functions. And in some shooting modes, it will also release the built-in flash and activate it for shooting. Now when you're done with it, just press the flash back down until it locks into place. Now for more flash power, less chance of red eye, and extra creative control, you can also attach an optional external flash to the Hotshoe. On the left side of the camera, under these two rubber covers, you'll find 5 jacks for connecting the D90 to other equipment. The first jack is for attaching Nikon's optional GPS receiver so that latitude, longitude, altitude, and time data are saved with each image's metadata. The next jack is for connecting your D90 to a television monitor with the supplied AV cable. That way you can view your pictures on a TV instead of the LCD. However, the HDMI port allows you to view your photos on a high-definition monitor for dramatically better picture quality. The required HDMI cable isn't included, but if you have an HD TV, get a cable for the camera. You'll be amazed at how great your photos look on a big screen. Next, there's a standard USB port for connecting the camera to a computer or even directly to a printer. And finally, there's a port for connecting an optional AC adapter that is sold separately. On the back side of the camera, you'll find the greatest number of dials, buttons, switches, and other controls. It might look complicated at first, but don't worry. Once you've learned the basic layout, you'll be able to change any setting you want quickly and easily. The most dominant feature on the rear of the camera is the impressive 3-inch LCD monitor. And just above that is the viewfinder, which is clear, bright, and a pleasure to use. In fact, one of the best things about taking pictures with an SLR instead of a point-and-shoot camera is having a high-quality optical viewfinder. There's a full array of status information shown in the viewfinder, including the focus points, the in-focus indicator, shutter speed, aperture, and the remaining capacity of the memory card. Before you start shooting, you need to take a second to focus the viewfinder optics to suit your own eyesight. You can do that by turning the diopter adjustment dial until the data displayed in the viewfinder appears sharp. Next to the diopter adjustment control is the Auto Exposure Lock, Auto Focus Lock button. We'll see how it's used later. We've already talked about the main command dial, so let's jump down to the Live View button. Live View enables you to display a real-time video image on the LCD monitor instead of using the normal viewfinder to take your pictures. In fact, you can even use the Live View mode to record home movies with the D90 instead of still photographs. To turn Live View on, you just press the button and it's ready to go. But note that now the regular viewfinder is blacked out and can't be used at all while Live View is turned on. To take a picture, you just press the shutter button like you normally would. Now to get out of the live view mode and go back to using the viewfinder, simply press the live view button again. Next, there's the multi-selector switch that functions kind of like a joystick for navigating through the menus, viewing the images that are stored on the memory card, and also for controlling which of the focus points are selected in the viewfinder. I'll usually refer to these controls during the rest of the DVD as the 4 arrow buttons. The OK button is pretty self-explanatory. Anytime you want to make a selection from the menus, you just press the OK button. It's also used as the record start stop button when you're shooting movies, but we'll talk about that later. Next is the focus selector lock switch. Rotating it to the L position will prevent the selected focus point from changing if the multi-selector is accidentally pressed. I recommend that you leave this unlocked. Next, there's the information display button, which can be pressed to bring up a shooting information screen that shows almost 36 different camera settings, including the shutter speed, aperture, the number of exposures remaining, and much more. Now, a lot of this data is also shown on the control panel and in the viewfinder. But sometimes, such as when the camera is on a tripod like this, it's a lot easier to see the settings displayed on the monitor instead. But that's not all this button does. Watch what happens when the Info button is pressed a second time. Now several of the settings along the bottom of the screen can be highlighted and then changed without drilling down into the menu screens. This shortcut can be a big time saver. To turn off the information display, you can either wait 10 seconds and the camera will do it for you, or you can press the Info button a third time. Over on the left side of the monitor, there are 6 additional buttons that have multiple functions each. There's the Delete button, the Playback button, the Menu button, the Protect button, the Thumbnail button, and the Playback Zoom In button. These all work closely with each other, so it makes sense to talk about them all at once. Both photographs and movies can be viewed on the monitor at any time by pressing the Playback button. This view is called the File Information Display. The most recently taken image or the last one you viewed is shown first. You can view other images stored on the memory card by using the left and right arrow buttons on the multi-selector to go backwards or forwards. You can always tell which image you're looking at by noting the numbers that are displayed in the upper right-hand corner. The number to the left of the slash tells you the number of the current image, and the number to the right of the slash tells you how many images are stored on the card. At the bottom of the screen, you can see the folder where the image is stored, the file name, the image quality, the image size, the time of day, and the date it was taken. To view additional information, you can press either the up or down arrow buttons to switch to the Overview Data display. Now we've added the exposure mode, the shutter speed, the aperture of the lens, a histogram, and other information. Whenever you're playing back images, they can be viewed individually, as seen here, or as thumbnails by pressing the Thumbnail button. You can choose to show 4 images per page, 9 images, 72 images, or even use the new calendar display to easily find photos organized by the day they were taken. Let's use the Playback Zoom In button to go back to the thumbnail page that shows 4 images. Notice that each photo is individually numbered, and a bar on the right side of the screen tells you approximately where you are in relation to the rest of the photos stored on the card. Any thumbnail image with film sprocket holes along the sides is a movie file. When you find a photo that you want to view full screen, just press the OK button to exit the thumbnail view. And if full screen view isn't good enough to see the details, for example, if you wanted to check to see if an image was in focus, you can press the Playback Zoom In button repeatedly to magnify the image. You can scroll around to see other parts of the photo by using the arrow buttons. To decrease the magnification, press the thumbnail button to zoom back out, or just press the OK button at any time to immediately return to the normal full-screen view. Now, if you're like me, sometimes you'll be able to tell right away that a photo you took is no good. So why not just get rid of it and free up some space on the memory card? You can do that with the Delete button. Whenever there's a photo displayed on the monitor that you don't want to keep, you can press the Delete button, and a confirmation screen will appear. Press the Delete button again to confirm the deletion, and the picture is gone, so be careful. However, for just the opposite situation, if you've got an important image on the memory card that you want to prevent from being deleted, press the Protect button. Whenever you see the key icon overlaid on any picture, that means it's locked and can't be deleted. Unless, of course, you reformat the entire memory card. To unprotect an image, just press the Delete button again. Even though the D90 has a couple of dozen external buttons, switches, and knobs, many of the camera's most important functions can only be accessed via the menu screens. And those are displayed on the monitor by pressing the Menu button. The color-coded display with intuitive descriptions facilitates easy viewing and speedy navigation. By the end of this DVD, you should have no problem navigating the menus and making changes. But for now, let's skip the menus because there's a whole chapter devoted to them later on. Now, you may have noticed that 3 of the buttons in this area of the camera also have labels written above them. That's because they aren't just used for playback functions, they are also used to change important camera settings while you're shooting. By pressing the WB button and turning the main command dial, you can change the white balance setting. To change the ISO setting, just hold down the button and turn the main command dial. The same thing goes for image quality and image size. To change the image quality, hold the button down and rotate the main command dial. Or to change the image size, rotate the sub-command dial on the front of the camera. Each of these settings can also be changed with the camera's menu system, but you'll quickly appreciate the convenience of having dedicated buttons right at your fingertips. Now, on this side of the camera, you'll find the slot for the memory card. The door is opened by sliding it back, but you should always make sure the camera is turned off before inserting or ejecting a card. If you forget, chances are nothing bad will happen, but it's just good practice to turn the power off before removing either the memory card, the battery, or the lens. Now, the D90 uses secure digital memory cards for storage, and pressing on the card briefly will eject it. Memory cards must be formatted before they can be used for the first time, and then later on, whenever you want to completely erase all of the images on the card and start shooting with a clean slate. I recommend that you reformat your memory cards every time you load them into your camera, assuming, of course, that you've already transferred all the images stored on the card to your computer for safekeeping. Please note that formatting a memory card will erase all files on the card, including any photos that have been protected. Formatting a card is very easy and takes just a couple of seconds. Start by pressing the Menu button, and then go to the Setup menu page, and choose Format Memory Card. Answer Yes, and the formatting will be completed in a few seconds or less. If I press the Info button, I can now see the total capacity of the memory card. In other words, at the current image quality and size settings, this is about how many exposures I can expect to capture on the card. Well, that's it. That concludes our walk around the camera. And you should now have a better understanding of the basic controls and settings on the D90. I know this chapter wasn't too exciting, but it's very important to have this basic foundation as we continue through the rest of the DVD. Like all digital SLRs, there are dozens of settings on the Nikon D90 that can only be changed by accessing the menus. Fortunately, the camera has a simple menu system that is very easy to understand. The menus have been divided into 6 main sections, each represented by an icon on the left side of the screen. There's Playback, Shooting, Custom Setting, Setup, Retouch, and Recent Settings. Now, because the D90 has over 90 different menus, and each of them have at least 2 and sometimes several settings to choose from, almost nobody could understand them all right away. And there's no reason you need to. A lot of the menus you'll probably never change, and the important ones will be covered as we go along. So just relax and learn the D90 at your own pace. A nice feature on the D90 is that it has a handy in-camera help system that covers nearly every menu on the camera. Whenever you see this icon on screen, you can hold down the Help button to show a brief description of the current menu selection. The explanations are actually quite helpful, and they make a good learning tool as you get to know the camera better. The playback menus control how you view images on the monitor, transfer images to a computer, or print directly to a printer. The shooting menus directly control the settings that determine the look, style, size, and quality of the pictures you take. The custom setting menus are used to change how the camera functions while you're shooting. You can customize things like the autofocus system, the metering and exposure controls, and many other settings to make them work however you like. The setup menus control things like the date and time, cleaning the image sensor, and formatting the memory card. The retouch menus allow you to make a variety of in-camera adjustments and enhancements to images after they have been shot. If you don't want to use a computer to edit your images, this is the next best thing. And you don't have to worry about damaging the original image because the camera automatically saves the retouch version as a new file. D-lighting automatically brings out detail in shadows to enhance the overall exposure. Red eye correction automatically detects and compensates for the annoying red eye effect sometimes caused by the flash. Trim can be used to produce cropped versions of your images. Monochrome changes your images to black and white, sepia, or cyanotype. That means blue tinted. Filter effects tries to simulate the effect you'd have gotten if you had used a traditional glass filter on the lens of your camera when you took the picture. Color balance changes the overall hue of the image. Small Picture creates smaller versions of your pictures for easy emailing or posting on a website. Image Overlay merges a pair of selected RAW files to create a new composite image. Quick Retouch creates a modified image with enhanced saturation and contrast. Straighten allows you to level your picture if accidentally shot a little crooked. Distortion Control is an advanced function that can be used to correct lens aberration. And finally, Fisheye creates optical effects that are similar to shooting with fisheye lenses. The retouch functions are okay for times when you want to make some simple image adjustments, but either don't have time or don't want to be bothered with using a computer. Just don't make the mistake of thinking retouch will entirely eliminate the need for a good photo editing software program on your computer. Whenever you have a picture stored on the memory card that is a retouched copy of an original image, this icon is superimposed to remind you. The final menu page is called Recent Settings. Here you'll find a list of the last 20 menus that you've changed on the camera, sorted in the order that you most recently accessed them. In other words, whenever you make a change to any menu setting, its name is automatically added to the top of the Recent Settings list. These shortcuts are a handy way of getting quick access to your most frequently used menus without having to dig down through layers and layers of menus. You can think of the Recent Settings list as being like shortcuts on your computer desktop. Well, that's about all we really need to cover for the menus right now. The important ones will be covered later, and the rest are either self-explanatory or should only be changed by advanced users who already know what they do. A big advantage that digital photography has over film photography is the ability to instantly view your images on the monitor while you're still out taking pictures. There's no more waiting hours or days until you get your prints back to see how you did. Now, if you remember, earlier in the DVD, we looked at some basic playback functions and learned how to review your pictures, protect a photo, zoom in to check the details of an image, and how to display images as thumbnails. Well, if you want to go beyond these basic playback functions, there are some advanced controls that you'll want to know about. Let's begin by pressing the menu button and navigating to the playback menu. There are 9 submenus within the playback menu that all affect the playback and editing of the images on your memory card. The delete menu is handy when you want to erase several images at once. You have the choice of deleting only selected pictures, deleting all the pictures taken on a certain date, or all of the pictures in the folder currently selected for playback, except, of course, any photos that have been protected. Let's choose Selected and see how it works. You can use the left and right arrow buttons to scroll through the images on the card and find the ones you don't want to keep. And then press the thumbnail button to mark them. Any pictures with a key icon superimposed are protected and can't be deleted. If you want to take a closer look at any picture, hold down the Playback Zoom In button momentarily to magnify it. Once you've selected the pictures to delete, press the OK button, highlight Yes, and then press the OK button again to finish the deletion. The next menu choice is Playback Folder. With the D90, you can separate your pictures on the memory card into various folders to organize them by subject, date, location, or whatever criteria you choose. Then you can use the Playback Folder setting to designate whether you are playing back images from all the folders at once or just a selected folder. I recommend you change this setting to all, so that you are always viewing every picture that's stored on the memory card. If you don't, you increase the chances of accidentally reformatting a card that has pictures on it that you may have forgotten about. Images that are stored on the memory card can also be hidden from view. This function is handy when you only want to display certain images during a slideshow. Next, Display Mode is a very important menu to know about. Earlier, we took a look at the 2 basic playback display screens. There was this one, called File Information, and this one, called Overview Data. Well, there are 3 advanced playback display modes that you can turn on if you want them. Let's put check marks in all 3 of the boxes to turn them on, and then select Done to lock in the changes. Next, let's switch the camera out of the menu mode and over to the playback mode. Now, instead of just having 2 playback display screens to choose from, we have 5. There's File Information and Overview Data that we just saw a minute ago. And now there's Shooting Data Page 1, Shooting Data Page 2, Shooting Data Page 3, an RGB histogram, and a display mode called Highlights. Notice the flashing white areas in the picture. That's called highlights, and it's the camera's way of warning you that part of your image is nearly pure white and therefore possibly overexposed. That's not necessarily anything to worry about, and depending on the subject of the picture, it might be perfectly acceptable. The camera is merely bringing it to your attention so that you are aware of it. When you see highlights flashing, sometimes you'll want to adjust the exposure settings and shoot the picture again to avoid overexposure. Now let's jump back to the playback menus again and continue going down the list. Image Review controls whether or not your images are displayed on the monitor automatically right after you shoot them. If you don't want them displayed, you can change this menu. When Rotate Tall is turned on, the camera will display vertical pictures resized and rotated on the monitor for easier viewing. Pict Motion is Nikon's name for creating an animated slideshow with synchronized music and special effects. You have 5 different choices for background music and 5 different choices for how the pictures transition from one to the next. Here's an example. Pict Motion really looks great on a high-def television, but I'll leave it up to you to experiment with the different creative choices and discover for yourself how they differ. Notice that even movie files on the card are integrated into the show. Next, the Slideshow menu offers an alternative way to play back images as an automated sequence, but without the razzle-dazzle of Pict Motion. The interval that each frame is displayed can be adjusted from 2 to 10 seconds, and that's the only customizable setting. I like Pict Motion and Slideshow because they provide an easy way for me to share my photos with friends and family without the need for a computer and special software. It transforms the camera from being just an image capturing device into a portable media player. The next menu, Print Set, allows you to print your photos directly to a compatible printer. But if you want better results, I suggest that you transfer your photos to a computer first, do some touch-up work, and then print them out. The final playback function I want to tell you about is the OK button. Whenever a picture is displayed on the monitor, you can press the OK button to jump straight to the Retouch menu. So if you find yourself using the Retouch menu often, this shortcut can save you a lot of time. One of the most important things to do before you start shooting is to verify that the image quality settings are the way you want them. If you shoot with the wrong settings, well, there might not be much you can do to fix the problem later. The D90 can record images with a number of different quality settings depending on your needs. Let's start by going to the Shooting menu and choosing Image Quality. There are 7 options to choose from. You've probably already heard the terms JPEG and RAW to describe the 2 main types of files that are recorded with digital cameras. In fact, you can set up the D90 to record either one or even both of them simultaneously if you'd like. In other words, with any of these 3 choices, you can have the camera save 2 files every time you trip the shutter, a JPEG file and a RAW file. So what's the difference between them? The RAW file format is digital photography's equivalent of a negative in film photography. It contains untouched raw pixel information straight from the camera's image sensor. So the advantage of the RAW file is that it offers you maximum control for image editing and making corrections later on the computer. But that's also the disadvantage, because RAW files will always require extra work before they can be used. On the other hand, JPEG is the worldwide standard for digital images, and it's the most popular and compatible format. It provides excellent quality, and it's easy to work with. Files are immediately ready for viewing or printing with no further processing. For the photographer who wants to spend more time behind the camera and less time at the computer editing, JPEG is probably the best format to use. During the rest of this DVD, we will only be shooting JPEG files, and there are 3 choices for JPEG quality: Fine, Normal, and Basic. The difference among the 3 choices is the level of compression that will be applied to the image. All digital cameras compress JPEG images before storing them on the memory card, so they take up less space. The higher the compression, the more pictures you can fit on a memory card. But the trade-off of higher compression is a noticeable drop in picture quality. Fine has the least amount of compression, and so therefore offers the best quality. That's the one we want. You should almost always shoot with the image quality set to fine. Now the next decision is to choose an image size. Image size is measured in pixels, and the greater the number of pixels, the better the image quality will be. On the D90, large images are 12.2 megapixels, medium images are 6.9 megapixels, and small images are 3.1 megapixels, which is still pretty big. But the large setting is almost always going to be the best choice. After all, the camera's high resolution is one of the reasons you bought it. My philosophy has always been that if it's worth shooting right. You can always make a large file smaller, but you can't make a small file bigger without a significant loss of quality. So, at this point, we've set the camera to record images with the JPEG fine quality setting and the large file size. That should really be your default settings for almost anything you shoot. However, there are a few advanced controls that can be used to further fine-tune the quality and style of your images. As I said earlier, there are 11 shooting modes on the D90, and we can divide them into two groups, the advanced modes and the point-and-shoot modes. We'll talk more about these modes later in the next chapter, but I wanted to remind you about them now, because the next picture quality settings I'm going to show you are only available in the 4 advanced modes. In the point-and-shoot modes, the camera sets them automatically. The first menu is called Set Picture Control, and it offers advanced control over sharpness, contrast, brightness, saturation, and hue. There are 6 presets, plus the option to fine-tune each one of them manually. Standard is the default setting and provides balanced, middle-of-the-road results. This is the best choice for most shooting. Neutral offers minimal in-camera processing and is the best choice if you will be extensively retouching your photos later on the computer. But if that's the case, you might want to consider shooting RAW instead. Vivid provides stronger, more vibrant primary colors. Monochrome reduces the color saturation to 0 so that you can take photos in black and white. Portrait lowers contrast and softens the sharpening to smooth out skin texture and hide minor blemishes. And Landscape is designed for outdoor shooting. So which of the 6 picture controls do I recommend you use? Well, that depends on you. If you're the kind of person who is going to load the images into your computer and do some image enhancements, such as sharpening and contrast adjustments, before you print your pictures, then I suggest either leaving it on standard or neutral. But if you plan on printing directly out of the camera, or if you simply don't want to be bothered with making adjustments on a computer, then go ahead and choose the setting that seems to go along best with whatever you're shooting. Vivid is my favorite setting if I'm not going to be editing on the computer. Another menu that is only available when you're using one of the 4 advanced shooting modes is called Active D-Lighting. Active D-Lighting attempts to preserve details in highlights and shadows, thus creating images with an improved contrast range. There are 4 levels to choose from that will control how strongly the effect is applied. Plus off, and of course automatic. Because the results of these settings are all subjective, I'll leave it up to you to do some experimenting of your own to see what looks better to you. But this is one of the few settings on the D90 that I actually leave on auto. Now, as handy as all this in-camera processing can be, in my opinion, the best approach is not to go too far with it. Keep the image manipulation to a minimum, and instead use an image editing program on your computer, where you have much more control. Plus, on the computer, you can easily undo anything that you don't like. As with any digital camera, once the D90 processes your photos internally, you've got to live with the results, whether you like them or not. The final thing I want to cover in this chapter is dust. One hazard of removing the lens from any digital SLR is that it exposes the inside of the camera to dust that could show up later as specks on your pictures. Fortunately, the D90 has an effective anti-dust system to fight this problem. But unfortunately, Nikon has it turned off by default. So, let's go turn it on. Press the menu button, go to the Setup menu page, and choose Clean Image Sensor. If you suspect that you've got a dust problem right now, you can set the camera down, sitting upright on a level surface, and choose Clean Now. The camera will vibrate the filter in front of the image sensor briefly to shake off any dust, and hopefully that will fix the problem. But if you're like me and change lenses all the time, thus increasing the chances of getting dust into the camera, I suggest that you choose one of these three options for routine automated cleaning of the sensor. It's not 100% perfect, but at least it improves the odds of fixing a dust problem before it's too late. You can have the camera clean the sensor at startup, at shutdown, or both. I prefer clean at startup, but the choice is yours. One of the most important parts of shooting great photographs is getting the exposure right. Even though you might be able to use a computer later to try and compensate for bad exposure, there's just no substitute for getting it right in the camera. Now, as I said at the beginning of this workshop, I'm going to assume you already understand what shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are, and how they interact to affect the exposure. Not to mention how they can be used to change the look, style, and quality of your pictures. But if you feel like you need more information, let me again recommend the Magic Lantern DVD called Great Photos with Your Digital SLR, or any of the general digital photography books published by Lark Books. I like to explain exposure by breaking it down into three parts. First, you need to decide which of the 11 shooting modes you're going to use. Second, if you choose one of the 4 advanced shooting modes, then you also have to tell the camera how you want it to meter the scene. Metering is how the camera decides what the best exposure settings should be just before it snaps the shutter. And third, there are a couple of minor controls that you can use to fine-tune the exposure. Choosing any of the 11 shooting modes is as simple as rotating the mode dial, which is divided into 2 parts, the advanced modes and the point-and-shoot modes. The 7 point-and-shoot modes are fully automatic, automatic with the flash disabled, portrait, landscape, close-up, sports, and night portrait. But no matter what they're called, all of these modes are really just slightly different variations of putting the camera on automatic control. So if you don't want to be bothered with thinking about the camera's settings and you're satisfied with shooting snapshots, just turn the dial to any of these modes and start shooting. But I encourage you to think twice before using any of the point-and-shoot modes, because they take too much control out of your hands. Not only do they change the exposure settings, they also override just about every other manual setting on the camera, including white balance, picture control, active D-lighting, the metering mode, and more. But to make matters even worse, in my opinion as a professional photographer, these modes don't even use the best settings for the type of shooting they are supposedly intended for. My advice is to learn to use the advanced modes, because in the long run, you'll become a better photographer for doing so. The 4 advanced shooting modes are Program Auto Exposure, Shutter Priority, Aperture Priority, and Manual Exposure. Once you feel comfortable using the D90, these are the modes you'll want to use as often as you can so you get the very best results. But which of the 4 modes should you use? Well, that depends on what you're shooting. If you're confident in your ability to set your own exposure and you want complete control, choose Manual. The manual shooting mode is the only one that gives you full control of shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and flash. It's entirely up to you whether the exposure is good or bad, so I don't recommend this mode unless you are a very experienced photographer. An easier mode to use is Aperture Priority. If controlling depth of field is important for your picture, choose Aperture Priority. For example, you'd probably want a small aperture for landscape shooting, so that everything is in focus, and a large aperture for shooting a portrait, so you can limit the depth of field. My second favorite mode is Shutter Priority. If controlling the shutter speed is important for your picture, then choose Shutter Priority. For example, you'd want a fast shutter speed, over 1,000th of a second for fast-moving action, and a slow shutter speed, under 1 second, for special effects like this. However, if you're new to photography, or for times when you don't want to bother tinkering with the camera's exposure settings, you can choose Programmed Auto, and let the D90 set the exposure for you. The difference between Programmed Auto and the point-and-shoot modes is that you still have manual control over most of the other advanced settings. I almost always shoot with either Aperture Priority or Shutter Priority, so that the camera is giving me some help, but I'm not letting it take over total control. Now, the second part of controlling exposure is to decide which method of metering you want the camera to use. Metering is how the camera analyzes the scene you're shooting and then calculates what the proper exposure should be. There are 3 metering choices on the D90. 3D Color Matrix 2, Center Weighted, and Spot Metering. You can choose to use any of the 3 when you're shooting with one of the 4 advanced exposure modes. But only 3D Color Matrix 2 is available in the point-and-shoot modes. 3D Color Matrix is the most complex metering mode because it analyzes exposure information from all over the frame. And because it works in sync with autofocus, it knows where the subject is situated in the composition, and thus gives that part of the frame priority. This is the best mode to trust for just about everything you shoot. It might not be perfect, but overall it will be very close. Center-weighted metering measures light from the entire frame, but places the greatest emphasis on a circular area in the center. Sometimes it might be an okay choice when the main subject occupies the center part of the frame, but usually you'll be better off with sticking with 3D Color Matrix. Spot metering is an advanced mode that only measures light from a very small area of the frame and ignores everything else in the picture. Because it's so precise, this is the most difficult metering mode to use, and it takes some practice to get it right. So, let's review. We've selected Aperture Priority as our exposure mode, and 3D Color Matrix as the metering mode. That's probably the combination I use most often, and I could start shooting right now with confidence that most of my shots are going to be properly exposed. However, in some situations, the metering system can be fooled into producing an underexposed, too dark, or an overexposed, too light image. So if you want good results with unusual subjects or in tricky lighting situations, sometimes you'll need to override the automatic exposure settings. There are several controls on the D90 designed for just that purpose. Let's take a quick look at the most important ones. The D90's exposure compensation function is the easiest way to manipulate the exposure settings. By holding down the exposure compensation button and turning the main command dial, you can increase or decrease the exposure. If you select a positive value, the scene will look brighter. If you select a negative value, it will look darker. What you were doing with exposure compensation is letting the camera figure out what it thinks is the right exposure, and then you are telling it to add or subtract a certain amount of light from that value because you don't agree with it. Depending on which shooting mode you're in, the camera will either change the aperture or the shutter speed to let in more or less light. Another easy way to manipulate the exposure setting is with the Auto Exposure Lock button. Now, under normal operation, the camera continually updates the exposure settings whenever the scene appears to get brighter or darker. Most of the time, that's exactly what you want the camera to do. But sometimes you don't want it to change the settings. By holding down the Auto Exposure Lock button, you can freeze the current exposure settings where they are so they won't change when you reframe your shot. You should be warned, though, that with the default setting, the Exposure Lock button will also lock the focus at the same time. I don't think that's such a good idea, because focus and exposure don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. So if you want to change the default mode, and I suggest that you should, go to Custom Setting menu, number F4, and choose AE Lock Hold. As you'll see later in the DVD, this will also be an important setting when it comes to shooting better quality movies. Now, let's take a closer look at ISO on the D90. ISO is a measurement of how sensitive the camera is to light. The higher the setting, the better the camera will be for shooting in low light. But that comes at a price. When you use a higher ISO, you are electronically amplifying the signal that is being generated by the CMOS image sensor. And the more the signal is amplified, the lower the picture quality will be. For best results in most situations, you should keep your ISO on a low setting. The ISO can be changed by pressing the ISO button and rotating the main command dial. ISO sensitivity can be set between 200 and 3200. For special situations, ISO sensitivity can even be raised above 3200 to high 0.3, which equals ISO 4000, high 0.7, which equals ISO 5000, and high 1.0, which equals ISO 6400. At the other end of the scale, you can go below ISO 200 to low 0.3, which equals about ISO 160, low 0.7, which equals about ISO 125, and low 1.0, which equals an ISO of about 100. On the D90, ISO 200 ought to be your normal setting, and you should only raise it when absolutely necessary. Obviously, sharp focus is a critical aspect of taking great photographs. With point-and-shoot cameras, you never have to think about focus. But with an SLR, you have total control over focus for really professional results. But it takes a little effort and some skill. The D90 lets you choose either autofocus or manual focus via this switch on the front of the camera. When the switch is in this position, you must do all the focusing yourself by turning the barrel of the lens. Flipping the switch to the AF position puts the camera into autofocus mode, and now it will focus automatically when the shutter button is pressed halfway. In fact, you actually have 3 different choices for autofocus mode. When you hold down the AF button on the top of the camera and turn the main command dial, you can cycle through the choices: Auto Select, Single Servo, and Continuous Servo. So how do they differ? In Single Servo mode, the camera sets the focus only once, when the shutter button is first pressed halfway, and then stays locked regardless of whether the camera or the subject moves. This mode is best for landscapes, posed portraits, or any other stationary subjects. In Single Servo mode, the shutter won't release until the lens has finished focusing. In Continuous Servo mode, the camera continually adjusts the focus as long as the shutter button remains pressed halfway down. Not only is this the best mode for moving subjects, especially sports, it's usually the best choice for all situations. The third mode, Auto Select, is a hybrid of the other 2. In this mode, the camera decides which of the other 2 modes to use, depending on what it thinks you're shooting. I don't recommend this mode because the results can be unpredictable and hard to control. So let's go back to Continuous Servo and choose it as the focus mode, because it's the setting I recommend for almost all of your photography. But we're not ready to start shooting yet. Now that you've selected the autofocus mode, there's another decision that needs to be made. You also have to tell the camera which area of the frame you want the camera to focus on. For example, in this shot, do we want the camera to focus here, here, or just let it decide automatically which is best? The part of the frame that the camera focuses on is called the active autofocus point. There are 11 autofocus points on the D90. And whatever is behind the active focus point, or points, is what the camera is going to focus on. Now you can either let the camera select the active focus point automatically, or you can choose it yourself. And that's what I recommend you do. Otherwise, you are giving up control over where the camera is going to focus. Keep in mind that the camera doesn't know what you're taking a picture of, so how will it know where to focus if you don't tell it? There are 4 options for autofocus area mode on the D90, but you've got to go into the menus in order to change the setting. There is no external button on the camera body for setting the autofocus area mode. But that's okay, because this is a setting that you probably won't change very often. First, press the menu button and navigate to Custom Setting menu number A1. Here are the 4 choices. Single point offers the most precise control, and this is the mode that I recommend you use 100% of the time. With this mode, the camera will focus on the part of the picture that is directly behind whichever one of the 11 focus points that you choose. You can easily change the active focus point at any time by making sure the focus selector lock is in this position, and then using the arrow buttons to highlight a different focus area with the multi-selector. I like this mode because it gives me exact control over which part of the frame I want to be in focus. I don't have to worry that the camera is going to focus on something I didn't intend. You can think of it as being like crosshairs in a gun sight. I put the focus point over the target, and then the camera will focus on it. It's that simple. The other options, dynamic area, auto area, and 3D tracking, don't provide the precise control necessary for taking creative photographs. If you let the camera decide on its own, it might be wrong as often as it's right, especially when the subject isn't dead center in the middle of the frame or the closest object to the camera. As you see, accurate and creative focusing involves more skill than just pointing the camera and letting it do all the work. If you try to get away with that kind of approach, you'll be very disappointed with the results. I encourage you to get out and practice. Experiment with the different settings. Try tracking moving targets like cars, kids, and pets. The more you practice, the better you'll get. Most light sources are not 100% pure white, but have a certain color temperature expressed in degrees Kelvin. The human eye adapts very quickly to these color temperature variations, so the differences are nearly imperceptible. But your camera isn't that smart. You can help avoid results like this or this by selecting the correct white balance setting on your camera and thus giving your images more accurate color reproduction. The D90 has 9 different white balance settings to choose from. Now, as we saw earlier, the mode can be selected by holding down the white balance button while rotating the main command dial to cycle through the choices. Or it can be set with the shooting menu. Let's use the menu this time. Automatic is the simplest setting to use, and not surprisingly, offers the least amount of control. Out of all the white balance choices, this is the one you shouldn't ever use because it provides the most inconsistent results. Incandescent can sometimes be the best setting if you are shooting indoors under regular household lighting. Fluorescent is designed to be used when your primary light source is ordinary fluorescent lighting that has a slightly greenish cast to it. Direct sunlight is for shooting outdoors on sunny days. Flash is almost always the best choice whenever you're shooting with either the built-in flash or an external flash. Cloudy can be used for shooting on overcast or mostly cloudy days. Shade is designed for use outdoors when the main subject is in the shade. K, or Choose Color Temp, lets you specify an exact color temperature in degrees Kelvin for the white balance. You can choose from 31 temperature settings that range from 2500 K to 10,000 K. But unless you have a thorough understanding of white balance, you should probably avoid using this mode. Preset Manual is the final choice, and it's the one I recommend that you use most of the time, because it offers the only way to set the camera's white balance accurately. Why? Because it's the only one that actually measures the color temperature of the current lighting situation and adjusts the camera to match it. If you use Automatic, the camera is just making an educated guess. If you use one of the other presets, you're just putting the white balance value in the right ballpark. You aren't actually setting the camera for the exact lighting conditions as they truly are at that time and location. Do all cloudy days have the same look? No. Does a sunny day have the same color of light at noon as it does at 6 in the evening? No. That's why I almost always set my white balance manually. I'm going to show you how to set a custom white balance with the D90. And it's so easy to do that I hope you get in the habit of doing it every time you go out to shoot. And then again when you move to a new location or when the lighting conditions change. It's not unusual for a professional photographer to set a custom white balance several times a day. First, place a white card under the same lighting that will be used for the subject of your photograph. Even a piece of bright white photocopy paper will work. Next, set the exposure mode to aperture priority. Press down the white balance button and rotate the main command dial until preset is displayed. Release the white balance button briefly and then press it down again and hold it for a couple of seconds. The preset icon will start to blink. Now frame up the white card so that it fills the viewfinder, making sure that the card is lit by the same light as the subject, and press the shutter release button. No photo will be taken, but the camera will measure the color temperature of the light striking the card and adjust the white balance to match it perfectly. If the camera was able to get a good white balance, good will be displayed on the control panel. And now you're ready to start shooting with a white balance that's perfectly matched to the current lighting situation. Now, how long did that take? 15 seconds? That's a lot easier than trying to fix your pictures later on the computer. The D90 simplifies flash photography by coming equipped with a built-in pop-up flash. Now in some of the point-and-shoot modes, the flash will pop up automatically whenever the camera senses that it's needed. But in other modes, the camera will never pop up the flash and you can't make it pop up either. That's another reason I recommend not using the point-and-shoot modes. On the other hand, when you're using any of the advanced shooting modes, you can manually pop the flash up whenever you decide that you want to use it. The decision is completely up to you, and the camera will never pop the flash up on its own in these modes. Now, I wish that I could say that flash photography was just as simple as popping up the flash and shooting away, but it's not. You also need to choose a flash mode. The flash mode is what determines how the flash is fired when you take a picture. If you hold down the flash button and rotate the main command dial, you can cycle through the 5 choices. But not all choices are going to be available in all the exposure modes. Right now, my camera is set for aperture priority. This icon means fill flash, and it's what I consider the normal mode for the majority of situations where I feel a flash is needed. If you're not sure which flash mode to choose, use this one. The next flash mode simply adds red eye reduction to the fill flash mode. Next, there's the slow sync mode, which attempts to achieve a mix of ambient light and the much brighter light generated from the flash. On the left is an image taken with fill flash. The subject looks fine, but you have no sense of the surroundings because the flash has overpowered the ambient light. On the right, we see what happens with slow sync. The camera was able to capture the subject along with the surroundings for a more natural look. The next mode simply adds red eye reduction to slow sync. And the final mode is called rear curtain sync. You might also see the word slow displayed with it, depending on the shooting mode you've selected. In this mode, the flash fires just before the shutter closes instead of when it first opens. When combined with a slow shutter speed, you'll create a streak behind a moving subject, with the subject frozen at the end of the frame, providing a great sense of motion. If you would like to know more about using flash with your D90, I recommend getting a copy of the Magic Lantern Prism Guide's Nikon AF Speedlight Flash System. It offers comprehensive information on using Nikon's creative lighting system. As we saw earlier, Live View enables you to display a real-time video image on the monitor instead of using the regular optical viewfinder to compose your shots. Now, I'll admit that Live View can sometimes seem more convenient when the camera is mounted on a tripod, but I don't recommend it for routine handheld shooting because it simply makes the camera too awkward to aim and hold steady. You know, the D90 is not a tiny point-and-shoot camera. It's an advanced SLR with an extremely high-quality optical viewfinder, so use it. But for those rare occasions when it does make sense to use Live View, you can turn it on by pressing the Live View button, and it's ready to go. To take a picture, you just press the shutter button. Another disadvantage with using Live View, besides making the camera hard to handle, is that autofocus isn't as fast or as accurate. And that delay, as the camera tries to focus, will really slow you down in some shooting situations, and could result in missed shots. Even Nikon warns in the owner's manual that there are about a dozen different situations where autofocus simply won't work very well during Live View. Although you can change the focusing mode for Live View by going to menu number A7 and choosing a different mode, it doesn't help. In my experience with the D90, even the new face detection mode is completely unreliable. My advice, if you must use Live View at all, is to leave this setting on wide area and hope for the best. But don't take my word for it. Try the different settings and see what you think works best for you. The Nikon D90's D-Movie mode is without a doubt the camera's most unique feature. Compared to tiny point-and-shoot cameras and cell phones that shoot video, the D90 delivers improved picture quality and dozens of lens options to stretch your creative wings. One thing I really appreciate about video from the D90 is that there are no tapes to transfer. And unlike the current crop of tapeless video camcorders, the video files that the D90 records are not an incompatible format. They're just regular AVI files, almost the video equivalent of JPEG files. The video clips are easy to watch using Windows Media Player, Apple QuickTime, and most of the popular video editing programs. Whenever you're in Live View mode, you can press the OK button to begin recording a movie. And then press it again to stop recording. How's that for being easy? A mic on the front of the camera records sound, while a speaker on the side of the body handles playback. Let's go to the shooting menu page and choose Movie Settings. 3 movie formats are available. The highest resolution being HD at 1280 by 720 pixels. The 640 by 424 mode is roughly equivalent to a regular standard definition television picture. And the 320 by 216 mode records smaller movies that you could post on a web page. The maximum continuous recording time is 5 minutes with the HD setting or 20 minutes with the other 2. Your choice of which movie mode is best for you will be determined by several factors. How will your movie be shown? Do you have an HD television that is capable of showing the HD movies that you shoot? Will you be editing your movies? If so, what resolution can your editing software handle? And so forth. Only you can answer these questions for you, and I strongly suggest that you do some experimenting right now before you shoot a bunch of movies with settings that were the wrong choice. In professional video production, that's called testing your workflow. Now, while the movie mode does make capturing short video clips fun and easy to do, it's not meant to replace a good camcorder, so don't expect too much from it. Here are some limitations of movie shooting that you should be aware of. Number 1, once the movie is started recording, there's no autofocusing. Only manual focus adjustments are possible, and that's very hard to see on the LCD monitor. Number 2, in the default mode, exposure will fluctuate constantly, as seen in this example, whenever the camera or subject moves. Number 3, the camera will tend to overexpose most movies, and it's very difficult to judge whether the exposure is right or wrong just by looking at the monitor. Number 4, with most lenses, you have no real control over the selected aperture or shutter speed that the camera will use. Number 5, audio is recorded as single-channel mono only. There's no windscreen for the built-in microphone, and there's no jack to connect an external microphone. And number 6, video is always recorded at 24 frames per second, rather than the more traditional 30 frames per second you're used to seeing on TV. So any motion in the picture might look a little jumpy to you. Here are a few tips to get you started off on the right foot shooting movies and overcome some of the challenges I just mentioned. Number 1, whenever possible, switch the camera and lens over to the manual focusing mode. Use the Optical Viewfinder to focus on your subject because it's a lot easier to see what you're focusing on. Then, turn on Live View and then start recording the movie. Number 2, when Live View is turned on, you can use the Playback Zoom In and Thumbnail buttons to electronically magnify the image on the screen to help with focusing. And then when you press the OK button to start recording, the image automatically switches back to the normal view. Number 3, try to avoid shooting subjects moving straight at you or straight away from you, because focus will be less of an issue. Number 4, if the exposure doesn't look right to you on the monitor, hold down the exposure compensation button and rotate the main command dial to make it lighter or darker. This is really the only influence you have over the exposure, no matter which of the 11 shooting modes you've chosen. I usually set my exposure compensation to -0.7. Number 5, to avoid the problem of having the exposure fluctuate while your movie is recording, like this, go to Custom Setting menu number F4 and change this setting to AE Lock Hold. You may remember that we already chose this setting during the exposure chapter. Now, when you're back in Live View mode and you've got the exposure set just the way you want it, you can lock in the exposure to prevent it from fluctuating by pressing the exposure lock button just before you start recording the movie. This icon down here reminds you that the exposure is locked and won't fluctuate like it normally would. So those are just a few easy-to-follow tips to make your movie shooting more successful if you want to try and get high-quality results. But don't forget, you can always ignore all my tips and just press the record button and start shooting. Over the course of this DVD, we've taken an in-depth look at the most important features of the D90. But this video is not intended to cover everything that the camera can do. The D90 is a state-of-the-art, highly complex photographic tool with hundreds of available options, and it would take a whole book to cover them all. So for a comprehensive guide to every feature and function, I recommend you pick up a copy of the Magic Lantern Guide's Nikon D90 book. It thoroughly covers every single aspect of operating the D90. At the end of a workshop like this, people often want to know what the bottom line is. What specific settings do I recommend? Well, that's almost impossible to answer because I'm constantly changing the settings while I shoot. However, here's what I would say are my typical settings for routine outdoor shooting with the D90. Aperture priority and shutter priority are my preferred shooting modes because I'm comfortable choosing my own camera settings. Personally, I never use any of the point and shoot modes, but they can be okay to use if you're new to SLR photography. My release mode is always set to single frame advance, even if I'm shooting sports or action. My focus mode is usually set on continuous and single point selection. I always choose the active autofocus point manually that works best for my composition. I use 3D color matrix metering most of the time. I always set a manual preset white balance for the most accurate and consistent color reproduction. My quality settings are always set for JPEG fine and the large file size. My ISO is usually at 200 unless conditions are too dark to allow it. And finally, I usually keep the picture control setting on standard. Like I said, there's no perfect group of settings for all situations, and you might find that you disagree with some of my recommendations. But that's what makes the D90 so great. You can customize your camera to work the way you like to shoot. You'll find that your understanding of the camera and the confidence you have in changing the settings will grow the more you use it. Now it's time to turn off the TV and get out and start taking great photos. Thank you for watching.